Okay, so thank you, Elizabeth, for your kind words of introduction, and thank you very much to the Church Monument Society for the invitation to speak on this occasion. I've been fascinated by church monuments for many years now, and I really have a deep interest in looking at the connections in particular between Ireland and Scotland, and how these can be, or how these are reflected in funeral monuments, gravestones, and funeral practices. Now, I hope you can see Grey Abbey, a magnificent former Cistercian abbey in County Down, in the Ards Peninsula of County Down. And let me begin on the 6th of September, 1843, when workmen were clearing away rubble within the walls of this ruin and discovered a previously unknown vault. When they entered the vault, they saw a coffin which looked to be in perfect condition, but which when touched, disintegrated. The workmen noticed underneath the coffin an inscribed stone, and beside it, leaning against the wall of the vault, another, the first two lines of which were inscribed, the rest of which were written in white paint. It turned out that the vault had been placed, erected by William Montgomery of Rosemount, Grey Abbey, the owner of a local estate. The inscriptions on the stones make reference to the fact that he had constructed the vault and revealed something of his thoughts about the practice of burial and the right of people to have their own tombs, and that those tombs should not be interfered with. The inscriptions make this very clear. If you see the second one, one of the first two lines have been in white paint. It says, "This is direct to mankind, and mostly to our offspring. This vault, Anno Domini 1699, is built at the cost of William Montgomery of Rosemount, reserved his burial place only of himself and his beloved wife." It makes mention of the fact that Sir William had been responsible for restoring the church. At one time, it had actually been used as a Protestant place of worship. While the other memorial warns of the infamy that would befall anyone who would interfere in a burial vault. Now, Sir William Montgomery was absolutely, you could say, obsessed with burial rites, with the right to be entombed in a particular place, and that those burial rites should be respected no matter what. And around the same time that he wrote, or rather around the same time that he erected his burial vault, he wrote a very interesting document, which he titled "A Treatise of Men's Rights to Dispose of Tombs, which themselves have made and dedicated." And this document, although it was never published, sets out very clearly Montgomery's views on this matter. And he drew on a wide range of authorities to back up his arguments. He refers to John Weaver's famous book on funeral monuments of 1631. He draws on classical writers of ancient Greece and Rome. And in his treatise, he argues that, as in all plantations and waste, uninhabited lands, a grave was a lawful possession into which no one had a right to intrude. Anyone who did would be guilty of sinful trespass and an odious scandal, and might himself happen to be a portion for foxes. And the same sentiments are poetically phrased on one of the inscribed stones in the aforementioned vault, where he has written, "Who this consecrated vault or room breaks up or takes from us ere day of doom, a portion may for swine or foxes be, loaded with just reproachful infamy." And so Montgomery, disturbing the contents of a vault or a mausoleum was a serious offence, especially, as he wrote, if there was room enough, if not in the church, yet in the churchyard, or as in a garden. He went on to condemn those who, to quote him, "as the vulgar do with their sepulchres in churchyards, made a charnel house of their burial places. Montgomery insisted in his treatise that his own tomb, no other bones shall be put in it to mingle with my dear wife's and my own, which will needs be when other coffins therein are laid and rotted away. So Montgomery was someone who felt very strongly about the right to have a burial space and the right to have it protected, respected, and not interfered with. Now, in terms of where were the Scots buried when they came to Ireland, well, must be remembered that at the time of the Reformation, the new Reformed Church of Ireland simply appropriated or took over the existing network of parish churches. In many instances, the church was repaired or restored or even rebuilt as a new Protestant place of worship. In other instances, the church was abandoned and a new church was built at a location more convenient to the majority of the Anglican population. There were also many ruined monasteries, abbeys, priories in Ireland, and these continue to be burial places, not simply for the Irish population, but also for the incoming Scots and English. And as is the case elsewhere, we can find information about where people wish to be buried through their wills. Now, you'll maybe be aware that in Ireland, unfortunately, so many wills were destroyed. Virtually all original wills prior to 1900 were destroyed in the Four Courts fire in 1922, which resulted in the loss of the old Public Record Office of Ireland. But still, many extracts and abstracts and even original copies of wills do exist. So to give some examples, William Hamilton, 1686, he wrote, "My body to be buried in the Cathedral Church of Downpatrick, in the small tomb I have erected there, after the manner and form prescribed by the Church of England." Baroness of Glenolly in the same year wrote that her body was to be laid in the vault of the parish church of Argylkirroge, that is in County Tyrone, where her late husband was buried. Reverend George Hamilton of Devonish and Bow in County Fermanagh in 1690 requested to be buried in Minay parish church beside his deceased wives. While one further example, Hugh Shaw in 1668 stipulated in his will that he's to be buried in the parish church of Donaghadee under my nephew's seat of Balnagavi, and that to be our constant burial place. So people could, in many instances, they did specify their place of burial. Sometimes you might even see in a will where somebody has gone to the lengths of actually including some of the words that were to go on their tombstone. So William Leslie in 1693 desired to be buried in Ballymoney churchyard, and you can see the ruins of the former parish church in Ballymoney, County Antrim, and a stone placed on his grave bearing the inscription, "Ye grave is my house, I have made my bed in ye darkness," from the book of Job, and also, "For I know that my Redeemer liveth," also from Job. And indeed, that is what appeared on his tombstone. Now, William Montgomery was born in County Tyrone about 1633. His mother was Catherine Stewart of the family of the Stewarts of Newton Stewart. Her father was one of the leading figures in Northwest Ireland in the early 17th century. Sadly, Catherine died just about a year after William was born. She died in 1634, and she was buried in Ardstraw Parish Church in Newton Stewart, County Tyrone. Now, unfortunately, her monument, which seems to have been a very grand affair, was destroyed in 1641. There was a major uprising in that year. There was huge loss of life, great destruction, and many churches and church monuments were deliberately targeted and as a result of the violence of that episode. And one of the casualties was the monument to Catherine Stewart, or Catherine Montgomery, the mother of William Montgomery. But Montgomery himself, perhaps drawing in a childhood memory, he would have been, after all, 8 years old when the monument was destroyed, so he would have remembered something of it, described it as being of curious and sumptuous, of diverse colours, all polished marble, inscribed with mottos and verses of his, that his, her husband's own composure, and gilded in every fit place. So writing some 60 years after its destruction, William Montgomery still had vivid memories of his mother's funeral monument in Ardstraw. Now, William Montgomery was the grandson of Sir Hugh Montgomery. He became Viscount Montgomery of the Ards, and Sir Hugh Montgomery was one of the leading figures in the settlements in Ulster in the early 17th century. He and another Ayrshire man, Sir James Hamilton, acquired vast estates in northeast County Down, and they brought over thousands and thousands of Scots to people their lands. Hugh Montgomery died on the 26th of May, 1636. Just over 2 weeks earlier, he drew up his will. And in his will, he too specified where he was to be buried. He writes in his will, "I commend my body to be decently interred." Well, that's crossed out and written as "buried in the church of Newton by the body of my dear wife." William Montgomery has left us a very interesting description of his grandfather's funeral. The funeral was to the priory, the former Dominican priory, in fact, in Newtonards, Dominican priory founded in the 13th century, and which in the early 1600s was taken over by the incoming Scots, taken over by Sir Hugh Montgomery, and the cloistered buildings were turned into his private residence, and the church of the priory was made the new Protestant place of worship. And in the year he died, a fine new tower was erected at the priory with this exceptionally fine Renaissance inspired gate, a doorway to it. Now, William Montgomery wrote this about his grandfather's funeral, and yet it shows something of his absolute fascination with burial practices. In this case, the format of the funeral of his grandfather. He writes, "His corpse being embalmed and rolled in wax cerecloths was closely coffined, now no more Lord of Montgomery, was locked up in a turret till a week before its interment, at which time, being in September the last mentioned year, 1636, it was carried privately by night a mile out of town, and in a large tent laid in state, and attended with the formalities of wax candles, friends, and servants, till the day of the procession on foot from the said tent to the church. The persons who made up the procession were all clothed in black." Then he goes on to give in great detail who was present at the funeral, and it's clear that the attendees at the funeral were drawn from across the Scottish community in Ireland, and also people from Scotland travelled across to this funeral also. He continues, "And now all being orderly entered and seated in the church, and the coffin placed before the pulpit, and the service ended, the Lord Bishop preached a learned, pious, and elegant sermon. This done, and the corpse moved to the upper end of the chancel, was, after the office for the dead performed, there inhumed, as Montgomery put it." We actually have a surviving, virtually contemporary account of the funeral, setting out the order in which people walked in the funeral procession, who walked in front of the coffin, who walked beside the coffin, who walked behind it, who was involved in carrying it, the different heraldic emblems that were on display. And it's clear that this funeral was much more than simply about interring a dead body. As Raymond Gillespie, one of our finest 17th century historians, has put it, this funeral provided an occasion both for the demonstration of the status of the deceased and a public demonstration of the passage of land and honour from one generation to the other. Without doubt, the funeral of Sir Hugh Montgomery, Viscount Montgomery of the Ards, was the spectacle of the Scottish colony in northeast Ulster in the early 17th century. Now, moving slightly further north, just outside the town of Ballycastle in County Antrim, are the ruins of Bonamargy Friary. Friary established by the Franciscans around 1500. It fell into disuse in the late 16th century, but in the early 17th century, it was restored as a place of worship by Randall MacDonald. MacDonald is one of the most interesting individuals to have lived in early 17th century Ireland. He was from a Highlands and Islands background. He was a devout Catholic, and yet at the same time, not only was he a patron of the Catholic Church, supporting the famous Catholic pilgrimage site at Loch Derg, he also built Protestant churches for the many thousands of lowland Scots he introduced to his estate. In 1604, he had been granted by King James some 330,000 acres in County Antrim, over 500 square miles, the largest land grant ever made in early 17th century Ulster. Now, he restored Bonamargy not simply as a Catholic place of worship, but also as a base for the Franciscans, from which they could go back into Scotland and try to recover certainly the Highlands and Islands of Scotland for the Catholic Church. He also built a burial isle at Bonamargy, and you can see in the bottom corner of the slide, you can see the burial isle that he erected at Bonamargy. It includes a vault underneath a stone floor, above which was a private area within the friary church for him and his family, and placed a tablet on the wall of this vault, referring to the fact that he, Randall MacDonald, now Earl of Antrim, built it 1621. Randall MacDonald, Earl of Antrim, died in 1636, and this is where he was laid to rest, in the vault in this burial isle. And just at the entrance to the burial isle, just within the walls of the Friary Church, there's this monument to John McNaughton, the first secretary, first, you might say, official manager, agent, trusted lieutenant to the first Earl of Antrim, who died in 1630. So said, MacDonald is an absolutely fascinating character in terms of, on the one hand, supporting the Catholic Church, and the other building Protestant churches. On the one hand, creating a base for the Franciscans, with relative safety at Bonamargy, and on the other, introducing many lowland Scots to people as a state. One of the places where we can really see MacDonald's handiwork is at Dunluce Castle. This magnificent castle, perched in a rock outcrop jutting out into the North Atlantic, was the principal seat of Randall MacDonald. He had a number of other castles as well, but this was his principal seat. Now, the castle itself has an older history, but in the early 17th century, MacDonald builds an English-style manor house within the walls of this castle. And he also attempts to develop a town beside it. In a field just beside the castle, he tried to establish a town. Now, it was not a success. For one thing, there was no natural harbour beside it. For another, it was too close to a rival at Coleraine. So it was one of those settlements that seems to have sprung up quickly, but also declined quite rapidly and never established permanent presence. And a number of years ago, around about 2008, 2009 or so, excavations were carried out at the site of the town and uncovered the foundations of houses, cobbled street, and many fascinating artifacts. Now, I mention that because a short distance away, a very short distance away, are the ruins of Dunluce Parish Church. One of the churches restored by Randall MacDonald, and in the burial ground adjoining that church are a number of 17th century memorials. So here's one now to Walter Kidd. And this particular stone was placed by him in memory of his children. The date on it is 1630. Like many stones of its date, the inscription runs around the edge of the stone before continuing across the center. It features a coat of arms, a heraldic device, but also very interestingly, it tells us a little bit about Walter Kidd. It mentions that he was a burgess of Irvine, a town on the west coast of Scotland, which had very strong links with Ulster. It also tells us that he was a merchant of Dunluce. So it's emphasizing both his origins and his status in Scotland, but also his new activities in Ireland. And we'll see some other examples of that in a moment. Also at Dunluce, now this is within the ruined church, we have the memorial to Florence Hamilton, the wife of Archibald MacPhilip, who was, according to the inscription, a merchant at Dunluce. And Florence died in 1674 and has the verse, "Death can dissolve but not destroy, who sows in tears shall reap in joy." And you'll notice on the memorial, it does have the skull and the crossbones. Over here, it has the bell and the hourglass, and then, of course, the coat of arms in between. So some evidences from gravestones and monuments to Dunluce's former importance as a commercial centre, but one that did not continue. A few other stones that make mention of connections with Scotland. This is one to Thomas McKee. It's in Whitechurch or Whitkirk graveyard in the Ards Peninsula of County Down. And again, you can see the format of the stone, the inscription in false relief running around the edge of the stone. You'll see it has a coat of arms on it. And it tells us that Thomas McKee was a burgess of well, it's meant to be Stranraer in Scotland. Unfortunately, their date is not actually legible, but I think we can safely say it's an early to mid 17th century gravestone. And in North County Antrim, it mentions, not two, but it mentions Thomas Boyd, who was provost of Irvine. Again, emphasizing the connections with that town in Scotland, and of the individual, despite having moved to Ireland, despite having acquired land in Ireland, Thomas Boyd was a tenant of the Earl of Antrim, successful tenant, but emphasizing his connection with Scotland and his status in Scotland. Now, this is a very interesting gravestone. It's now within the walls of Bangor Abbey Church in County Down. Bangor Abbey is a Church of Ireland church in County Down. And it's to Thomas Bradshaw. It's to members of the Bradshaw family. Certainly in the early 1600s, there was a notable Bradshaw family in Irvine, again, emphasizing connections with that particular town in Scotland. And it tells us that the inscription on the stone, which is dated 1620, tells us that Thomas Bradshaw was a baillie in Bangor, a baillie being a Scottish word for a municipal magistrate. So in this case, it's emphasizing his role and his status in the developing town of Bangor in North County Down. And it's very interesting. You can see the skull and the crossbones. You see the heart. It actually says Memento Mori. And then we have the figures here representing Thomas Bradshaw or Bradshaw and other members of his family. And there's wonderful detail here in terms of their costume. Now, we don't have very many gravestones in the 17th century as a whole, which include tools of the trade of the deceased. I know in other places, certainly in Scotland, you'll find a far greater number of tombstones that actually display the tools, the trade tools of the deceased. Well, one of the few examples in Ulster or in Ireland to a Scotsman with tools of the trade on it is this memorial in Bangor Abbey to William Stinners, who died in 1626. And the inscription tells us that he was a master mason. And yes, we see the tools of the mason inscribed on his tombstone. Now, William Stinners may well have been the man responsible for rebuilding Bangor Abbey Church in the early 17th century. It was a place of worship very much associated with Sir James Hamilton, who was the other great figure in the Scottish settlements in northeast County Down. He too was ennobled. He became Viscount Clandeboy at the same time that Montgomery was made Viscount Montgomery of the Arts. And in his will, he requests burial within Bangor Abbey. And the church was rebuilt around about that time. Most of the church was rebuilt around about that time. And William Stinners may well have been the individual responsible for that. It must be said that most of the surviving memorials to Scots from 17th century Ireland are not necessarily to the very top level of society, the landowners, for instance. A great many of them are those who were of, you might say, intermediate status, the freeholders, the substantial farmers, the more successful merchants in the towns. This is a rare example of a tombstone to an actual landowner in the plantation of Ulster. It's in Desert Crate, which is in East County Tyrone near Cookstown, and it has a really very interesting inscription. The inscription is in Latin, as you can see it runs around the stone. We have a figure of a man standing here. We have a horse here. We have a skull, which has been carved as if one were looking down directly from it, from above. And we have quite faintly incised the crossed bones. It's not of particular quality, but the inscription is really very interesting. It tells us that it was erected in memory of Alexander Sanderson. And the inscription goes on to tell us that he was born in Scotland, that he was a foot soldier in Belgium, that he was a cavalry officer in Poland. He then came to Ireland, where he served as a justice of the peace and high sheriff of County Tyrone. And then we can see across the centre, commit my work to God, and then refers to a happy death and rest from one's labours. So Sanderson was indeed someone who, born in Scotland, but like so many other Scots at this time, headed east, was involved in the 30 Years' War, survived that conflict, moved to Ireland around about the mid-1610s, acquired an estate in County Tyrone, and established a dynasty that was to continue for many, many generations. The family was really a major landowner in County Cavan, where some of them resettled in the latter part of the 17th century. But the inscriptions remind that people could have really very interesting careers even before they came to Ireland, and felt it was important to record those facts on their tombstones for posterity. Now, going back to Grey Abbey, and this is the memorial to Sir James Montgomery. This is the memorial to the father of William Montgomery, the author of the treatise, the man who was obsessed with burial rites. And this is the monument that he erected to his own father, Sir James Montgomery, who established the family at Rosemount, Grey Abbey. And it's a fine mural monument. You can see it's, unfortunately now it's been slightly damaged, slightly worn away. There was some destruction to the ruined Grey Abbey in 1839, the night of the big wind. when there was a ferocious storm blew across Ireland, and we know that there was destruction in many places, but we know there was destruction at the ruined Grey Abbey. But you can see it's a classical composition. Includes a number of panels with inscriptions, poetry, words of praise for Sir James, no doubt written by his son. And Sir James actually met an unfortunate end in 1652 when he was traveling down the east coast of England. His vessel was attacked by pirates and he was killed in the ensuing fight. But his son felt it was hugely important that he should be remembered appropriately at Grey Abbey. And so we do have this fine monument erected there. So you could say James Montgomery was another person from the upper tiers of society, from the top level, the landed elite. But it must be said that a remarkable number of, the very leading figures in the Scottish community in Ireland, for them, there's no monument. I mean, for example, I've mentioned the funeral of Sir Hugh Montgomery in 1636, the very grand occasion that it was, and yet there's no monument surviving to that Sir Hugh Montgomery. Likewise, in Bangor, there's no monument to Sir James Hamilton, Viscount Clannaboy, despite him being one of the leading figures in Ireland in his day, never mind simply in the Scottish community in Ireland. Whether ravages of time, no doubt the 1641 rebellion played its part as well. But the survival rate for those from the very upper reaches of society is not as good as might be expected or even might be hoped for. Now, within the migration of thousands of Scots into Ireland in the course of the 17th century, members of the clergy formed a very important element. And certainly in the early first half of the 17th century, upwards of 100 Scots moved to Ireland as clergymen, as ministers. This monument is in the cathedral in Raphoe. Now, there's nothing particularly elegant about it. It must be said, it's really quite crudely constructed, positioned as it is now behind a radiator in the church, but it was erected in memory of the wife of Archibald Adair. Adair was from southwest Scotland. The Adair family were prominent around Port Patrick, Kinhelpt, and Adair himself had spent some time in Paris in the years around 1600. Was drawn into some of the religious controversies between the Huguenots and the Catholic theologians at that time. But around 1610, he moved to Raphoe, the Diocese of Raphoe in County Donegal, to become Dean of Raphoe. And this monument was erected in memory of his wife, Janetta Houston, who died young. She was only about 20 when she died. But even by that stage, she'd already given birth twice to twins. But only one inscription. It's maybe not totally clear what was meant by the inscription, but it seems to suggest that one child of each set of twins survived. But it goes into in Latin poetry. It praises her many qualities, her virtues, her piety, and so on. But this is a memorial to the wife of the Dean of Raphoe, surviving today in the cathedral in Raphoe. As well as, you might say, parish clergy or deans within the church in Ireland, a number of Scots rose to become bishops within the Church of Ireland. We often think of the Scottish ministers coming to Ireland in the 17th century as Presbyterians through and through, but actually, certainly in the early 1600s, most of them were members of the Episcopal, well, they were all members of the Episcopal Church, but most of them were quite comfortable as members of the Episcopal Church. One of the most important of those Scottish bishops in Ireland was George Montgomery, initially appointed Bishop of Raphoe, Derry, and Clogher in 1605. He later became Bishop of Meath, diocese much closer to Dublin. And Montgomery was someone who worked very hard to ensure the rights and privileges of the new Reformed Church were upheld, that the land he believed that should belong to the church did belong to the church, and he can be regarded as someone who was certainly committed to ensuring the financial security of the Church of Ireland. He doesn't receive great credit for his, you might say, evangelizing among the people of Ireland, but certainly as an administrator, he was a competent individual, certainly in his early years as bishop. Well, this is the monument to Montgomery in Ardbraccan in County Meath, and it's a freestanding tomb, very interesting. It has provoked some criticism, it must be said. In 1814, a commentator described it as the actual workmanship as some of the rudest productions of the chisel that can be well conceived. The inscription refers to Montgomery as Scoto Britannis. Montgomery actually died in London in 1621, but was brought back to Ardbraccan for burial. And you can see on it 3 sculpted figures, believed to represent Montgomery, his wife Susan, and their daughter Jane. And we can't necessarily be too critical of it because the monument does seem to have been damaged and was reconstructed, you could say, around 1750, which might account for the somewhat odd arrangement of some of its features. So maybe we shouldn't be necessarily too hard. Nonetheless, it's interesting that the architectural historians would say that the figures are quaint rather than accomplished, and suggesting that the sculptor may have been not quite an expert in portraiture, but certainly he had other gifts as a craftsman. But certainly this is a monument to Bishop George Montgomery, one of the leading figures in the Church of Ireland in early 17th century Ireland. Now, another monument, we need to go further south, and this is a memorial which is possibly, now there's no absolute certainty with this, but possibly to Malcolm Hamilton, who was became Archbishop of Cashel in 1623. And the monument is at the Rock of Cashel in County Tipperary. But as I said, it's not absolutely certain that that is the memorial to Malcolm Hamilton, that no inscription survives on it. But again, it demonstrates the extent to which Scots were able to become senior figures in the new church in Ireland, and not simply in the northern part of Ireland where most of the Scots were settled, but in other parts of the island as well. And certainly under Malcolm Hamilton and his successor as Archbishop, another Hamilton, Archibald Hamilton, a small but significant colony of Scots was established in and around Cashel in the early 17th century. Now, looking at some of the parish clergy, we have this really rather fascinating monument, tombstone, to the Reverend James Trench at Clongill in County Meath. Trench was, it seems, his family seemed to have connections to Eyemouth on the east coast of Scotland. And this inscription is very detailed. You can see the way it, again, runs around the edge of the stone and then continues across the middle. We see skull and crossbones. We have a shield here, but either the emblems have worn away completely, or perhaps it was never actually completed. We have a range of tools here with the initials J.T. James Trench here. We have a sunburst, and we have a strange cat-like creature carved on the stone as well, a rather elongated cat. I'm not sure whether it's maybe even meant to be a lion, but certainly it's it doesn't look either like a cat or a lion for that matter, but it's part of the decoration on this tombstone. And Trench represents one of a number of Scottish ministers who took up parishes in Meath. No doubt his connection with Bishop Montgomery accounted for his presence in County Meath, but there are others as well. I've mentioned Malcolm Hamilton, his connection with Tipperary. So when it comes to the Scottish clergy, we see them distributed much more widely across Ireland than we might imagine. They're certainly not all concentrated in the north of the island in the areas of Scottish settlement. Their distribution is much wider. So this is the Reverend James Johnston. And James Johnston was a Presbyterian minister in County Fermanagh. He died in 1665. And the inscription is in the old graveyard of Aherlurker, an old pre-Reformation site that was used as a burial place by the Scots and by the local population, continued to be a burial place after the Reformation, certainly not abandoned. And we see, look at the way that the grass had been growing over the tombstone. So simply peeling it back, like lifting a mat on top of the tombstone. And we see how well preserved the decorative features are underneath. So we have the skull, we have the crossed bones, we have the open book, and then we have the hourglass, as well, of course, as the shield, the heraldic devices, the mantling around it as well. Unfortunately, the inscription is, or has been, almost completely worn away, but on the panel, the features really stand out very strongly. And one more memorial to a Scottish clerical family. This is an old MacPatrick graveyard in County Tyrone. And this is the enclosure constructed for the Sinclair family. And in the 1660s, the Reverend John Sinclair, who is from Caithness, moved to County Tyrone and became a Church of Ireland minister in the Strabane area, and remained minister there through until the earliest years of the 18th century. This particular panel is within that enclosure. There's no date on it specifically, but it's probably from around about 1700 or just right at the very end of the 17th century. And it displays this wonderful array of mortality symbols. We've seen some of these already, but here we have them very pronounced, very clear. So we have the skull and crossbones, but we have here a bell, we have the open book. Down here we have the crossed tools of the grave digger. We have a coffin. And very unusually, there are very few examples of this in gravestones to Scots in 17th century Ireland. We have a tree entwined by a serpent, obviously going back to the story on Genesis of the fall of man. So here we have the full panoply of mortality symbols. Perhaps this is down here is meant to be an hourglass, but apart from the hourglass, which is maybe there but not so obvious, we have a wonderful array of the mortality symbols. And of course, the Scots were bringing these ideas with them. And obviously they were drawing on local practices and ideas and in terms of funeral sculpture and so on, but essentially they were bringing their ideas on commemoration, on burial, on symbolism with them from their homeland. Some more. This is Taboyne in East Donegal. The inscription, again, you can see it's in false relief. Unfortunately, the date is not absolutely clear. We can see a 1, we can see a 6, but we can't make out the third digit, unfortunately, which would be the key one to place it in a particular decade in the 17th century. But we do see the skull, or death's head. We see an hourglass carved here. And then we have a shield that I'm not sure, but that looks a bit like a thistle carved on the tombstone, which would be very interesting. It's to an individual named Prid, P-R-I-D. And this is one of a number of very interesting tombstones in this churchyard. There's another one The earliest is dated 1626, and the surname has gone, unfortunately, but it tells us that the deceased was a cloth worker, no doubt involved in the nascent textile industry in the area. We know there were some woolen mills in Taboyne in the 1620s. Perhaps the individual was employed or even operated one of those. And here in Caledon, in South County Tyrone, again, we can see a number of different mortality symbols, the skull, the crossbones, the coffin, the hourglass. We have a rectangular depression here. Is that meant to be an open grave? I'm just not sure. You can even see a notch cut here in the edge of the stone, which would allow water to drain from it. The inscription is very interesting. It's to, well, the inscription isn't particularly interesting. It's to an Edward Wood who died in 1673, but it does look a bit like some of the inscription, at any rate, has been removed in the creation of this panel with the mortality symbols and the coat of arms and very elaborate mantling, almost as if the inscription was carved first and then the decorative features were added. And going back to Taboyne, we have a number of examples on tombstones to the Scots in 17th century Ireland, where we have the famous the verse, remember man as thou goes by, as thou art now, so once was I. Well, here we have it on this stone to a Matthew Lindsay, Taboyne. You can see the date, 1680. Unfortunately, it's sort of sunken down and the shadow is quite pronounced, but you can certainly see 1680. And we can see the verse here, which I've turned around so you can see it. So remember man, as thou goes by, as thou art now, so once was I. As I am now, so shall thou be. Remember man, that thou must die. Which, of course, is really the Pope. In poetry, the equivalent in poetry of the mortality symbols, skull and crossbones, hourglass, and so on. And finally, this is a very interesting stone. It's not strictly speaking a gravestone, but I've put it up anyway. It's built into a bridge in the village of Ardegarbon in County Tyrone. And you can see on it, it displays a crucifixion scene and has the inscription Adi Gloriam Robertus Algio, 2nd of May, 1625. Very curious, you might think. What even is it meant to be? How did it end up in a bridge? Well, I can't answer that, how it ended up in a bridge. Robertus Algio doesn't sound very Scottish, but in fact, there was an Algio family around in and around Paisley in Scotland in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, this particular part of County Tyrone was allocated to the Hamiltons of Paisley, the chief of whom was the first Earl of Abercorn, and two of his brothers received lands in this area as well. Now, some of those Hamiltons were Catholics, and as a result of their patronage, a small but significant colony of Scottish Catholics emerged in the Strabane area. And Robert Algio was one of those leading Scottish Catholics. We know he was employed by the Hamiltons to help manage their estates. We know that he opened his house for the celebration of Mass. And we know that in 1630, Scottish Catholics enjoyed quite a degree of religious freedom in and around Strabane, which of course ran totally contrary to the intention of those behind the plantation scheme. They wanted to establish a British and a Protestant settlement in Ulster. And certainly there was a strong Scottish settlement in Strabane, but it included a significant number of Catholics, running totally contrary to the intention of those who devised the plantation scheme. And this wonderful stone built into the bridge in Ardegarbon is a very powerful reminder that the story of the engagement of the Scots with Ireland in the 17th century is certainly far from straightforward. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.